The night I gave away my last meal, I thought I was helping a hungry stranger. I had no idea I was feeding the man who owned the entire company that would soon control my future. The wind moved through the narrow alley behind the diner like a quiet warning, carrying the smell of rain and car exhaust from the busy street beyond. Lily Anderson stepped out the back door of the small restaurant where she worked, tying the thin strings of her apron behind her back as the door closed with a tired metallic sound. It had been a long shift, the kind that left her feet aching and her head heavy, and tonight the tip jar had been almost empty. She checked the inside pocket of her jacket. $2 bills and a few coins. That was everything she had left until her next paycheck. In her hand, she held a small white takeout container that the cook had let her take home after closing. Inside was a simple meal, grilled chicken with rice and vegetables, the last food she would have until tomorrow night if she stretched things carefully. The street behind the diner was quiet except for the distant rumble of buses and the soft flicker of a broken streetlight that painted the pavement in weak yellow circles. Lily sat down on the cold concrete step beside the metal dumpster and opened the container. Steam rose gently into the night air. She whispered to herself with a tired smile that at least dinner smelled good. She had just lifted the plastic fork when a voice came from the darkness beside the alley wall. "Excuse me, do you mind if I sit here for a moment?" Lily turned quickly. A man stepped forward slowly, his coat worn and dusty, his hair slightly unkempt as if the wind had been his only companion for days. His face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had not slept well in a long time. He looked older than her by at least 15 years, maybe more. His eyes, however, were calm, thoughtful, and strangely gentle. Lily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, there's plenty of space." The man lowered himself onto the edge of the step, keeping a respectful distance. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The city noise hummed softly in the background. Then, the man looked toward the food in her hands and quickly looked away as if embarrassed by the movement. Lily noticed. She looked down at the container again and then back at him. "Are you hungry?" she asked quietly. The man gave a small, tired laugh that sounded almost apologetic. "I suppose that is an obvious answer." Lily studied his face. Something about him did not feel threatening. Just tired. Very tired. Without thinking too long, she took the fork, divided the meal into 2 uneven portions, and slid half of the rice and chicken toward him inside the container. "Here," she said gently, "we can share." The man looked at the food, then at her, surprised. "You do not even know me," he said slowly. Lily shrugged with a small smile. "I know what it feels like to be hungry. That is enough." Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The man accepted the container with careful hands, as if it were something far more valuable than a simple meal. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice carried a tone that felt heavier than the moment required, almost as if the kindness meant more than Lily could understand. They ate in silence for a few minutes while the wind moved through the alley and the broken streetlight flickered again. After a while, the man looked at her thoughtfully. Why would someone who clearly does not have much share their last meal with a stranger? Lily wiped her hands on a napkin and looked out toward the dark street, where cars passed in blurred streaks of light. Because sometimes, she said softly, the only thing worse than being hungry is feeling invisible. The man studied her face as if memorizing every word. A strange, quiet expression crossed his eyes, something that looked almost like respect. When they finished eating, he folded the empty container slowly and held it for a moment. Then he spoke again in a calm voice that carried a hint of something Lily could not quite place. "Someday," he said, "I hope the world shows you the same kindness you showed me tonight." Lily smiled faintly, not realizing that the stranger beside her was Alexander Reed, the founder and owner of Reed Global Industries, one of the largest companies in the entire country, and that the small meal she had just shared would soon change both of their lives forever. The next morning, Lily Anderson woke before sunrise with the cold weight of reality pressing quietly against her chest, and the first thing she realized was that the stranger from the alley was already beginning to feel like a dream. The narrow room she rented above an aging convenience store was barely larger than a storage unit, with faded wallpaper curling at the corners and a single window that looked down toward the empty street. A delivery truck rolled past outside, its engine rumbling like distant thunder through the thin walls. Lily sat up slowly on the narrow mattress and rubbed her eyes. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined the entire conversation from the night before. The tired man, the quiet way he had thanked her, the strange calm in his eyes. She pulled on her jacket and reached into the pocket where she usually kept loose receipts and spare change. Her fingers brushed against something light and crinkled. It was the napkin from the diner, the same one she had used while sharing a meal. She stared at it for a long second before folding it again and placing it carefully on the small wooden table beside the bed. It felt strange that such a small moment had stayed in her thoughts so clearly. She whispered to herself that it had only been dinner, just another ordinary act of kindness on an ordinary night. Outside, the early morning air smelled of rain and gasoline as the city slowly woke around her. Lily walked the 3 blocks toward the diner with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket. The sidewalks were still damp from the night storm, and the sky above the buildings carried a pale gray color that meant another long day of work was beginning. When she pushed open the diner door, the familiar bell rang above her head, and the warm smell of coffee wrapped around her like a blanket. The cook was already at the grill, and the first regular customer sat quietly reading a newspaper at the counter. Lily tied her apron and began preparing the tables, stacking menus, and refilling the glass sugar jars. Yet several times that morning she found her thoughts drifting back to the man in the alley. The way he had asked why she would share food when she clearly needed it herself. The way he had listened so carefully when she spoke. Something about him had felt different from the other strangers who sometimes wandered near the restaurant. During the lunch rush, Lily moved quickly between tables carrying plates and pouring coffee. But the tips were smaller than usual, and the manager reminded her twice to work faster. By late afternoon, her feet ached again, and the $2 bills in her pocket had not multiplied into anything better. As the sun lowered behind the tall office buildings across the avenue, Lily stepped outside during a short break and leaned against the brick wall beside the diner entrance. The same alley where she had shared her meal stretched quietly beside her, now filled with afternoon shadows instead of yellow streetlight. She looked down the empty space for a moment, half expecting to see the stranger again sitting on the step with his worn coat and thoughtful eyes. But the alley was empty. Lily gave a small, tired smile and shook her head as if she were laughing at herself. The world was too busy for stories like that to repeat themselves. Inside the diner, the bell above the door rang again as new customers entered for the evening shift. Lily took one last breath of the cool air before stepping back inside, never imagining that somewhere across the city the same man she had fed the night before was now sitting at the top floor of a towering glass building, quietly holding the folded takeout container from their shared meal and thinking about the young waitress who had treated a stranger with more dignity than most people had shown him in years. Across the city, the glass walls of Reed Global Industries reflected the pale afternoon sky like a mirror of quiet power. From the outside, the tower rose above the surrounding streets with the calm authority of a place where decisions were made that shaped entire industries. Inside the top-floor office, Alexander Reed stood beside the wide window overlooking the endless movement of traffic below. The city moved with its usual rhythm of buses, taxis, and hurried pedestrians. Yet his thoughts were far from the board meetings and financial reports waiting on his desk. In his hand, he held something simple and unexpected, the small folded takeout container from the night before. The cardboard edges were slightly bent, and a faint smell of rice still lingered inside. To anyone else, it would have looked like trash left behind after a cheap meal. To Alexander Reed, it had become something entirely different, a quiet reminder of a moment he could not easily explain. He turned the container slowly in his hands as the door behind him opened and his assistant stepped inside the office. Her name was Caroline Hayes, and she had worked beside him for many years, long enough to understand the difference between the public leader of Reed Global and the private man who sometimes surprised even his closest staff. Caroline stopped a few feet from the desk, holding a tablet filled with the schedule for the afternoon. The board of directors will arrive in 20 minutes, she said calmly. The finance committee is waiting in the conference room, and the investment presentation begins shortly after that. Alexander nodded without turning from the window. For a moment he remained silent, still looking down at the city below. Finally he spoke in a thoughtful voice. Caroline, how many people work across all divisions of this company? She answered without hesitation. More than 40,000 employees across the country. Several thousand more through partner organizations. Alexander gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. 40,000 lives connected to one company, and yet last night, the most honest conversation I had was sitting beside a diner dumpster, sharing half of a simple meal. Caroline tilted her head slightly, surprised by the comment, but wise enough not to interrupt. Alexander walked back toward the desk and set the container down carefully beside a stack of financial documents worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. I spent the last several weeks moving through the city without anyone recognizing me, he continued. No suites, no meetings, no drivers waiting at the door, just walking the streets and listening. Most people never notice someone like me unless there is money attached to my name. But one person did not care about any of that. Caroline understood then that he was referring to the experiment he had begun earlier that month. Alexander had insisted on leaving the comfort of his corporate life to see how ordinary people truly lived in the city his company influenced every day. Some of his advisors had quietly warned that it was a strange idea for a man responsible for billions of dollars in assets. Yet Alexander had ignored the warnings. And now he was standing beside his desk, holding a memory that seemed far more valuable than any financial projection. Who was she? Caroline asked gently. Alexander leaned back against the desk and folded his arms as if replaying the moment in his mind. A waitress, he said slowly. Her name is Lily Anderson. She barely had enough food for herself and still chose to share it with a stranger she believed had nothing. Caroline glanced at the container on the desk again. That kind of kindness is rare, she said quietly. Alexander nodded. Yes, and that is exactly why I cannot forget it. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun dipped lower behind the skyline, painting the glass buildings in warm gold light. In that moment, Alexander Reed realized something simple but powerful. In a city filled with ambition, money, and endless competition, a young waitress with almost nothing had reminded him what dignity looked like. And he had every intention of finding her again. The evening air carried the quiet warmth of early summer as the lights of the city slowly came alive one building at a time. Inside the diner, Lily Anderson moved between tables with practiced speed, balancing 2 plates in one hand and a coffee pot in the other, while the low hum of conversation filled the room. The dinner rush had arrived, and every booth was occupied by tired office workers, delivery drivers, and regular customers who came every evening for the same hot meals and familiar faces. Lily greeted each person with the same small, polite smile, even though exhaustion tugged at the corners of her eyes. The manager behind the counter kept glancing at the clock while calling out orders toward the kitchen window where steam rose from the grill. For Lily, the routine felt almost comforting. Take an order, refill coffee, carry plates, clear the table, then begin again. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, the memory of the stranger in the alley still lingered like a quiet question she could not fully dismiss. During a brief pause between customers, she stepped toward the counter and poured herself a small glass of water. Megan, another waitress who had worked there nearly as long as Lily, leaned beside her with a tired laugh. Long night already, Megan said while rubbing her shoulder. Lily nodded. It feels like the entire city decided to eat here tonight. Megan glanced toward the front windows where headlights passed in slow streams outside. You ever think about leaving this place? She asked suddenly. Maybe finding something better. Lily thought about the question for a moment before answering. Every day, she said honestly, but until something changes, this is what I have. Megan smiled with quiet understanding before returning to her tables. A few minutes later, Lily stepped outside again to carry a bag of trash toward the metal dumpster in the alley. The evening sky had darkened, and the same broken streetlight flickered above the narrow pavement. She paused for a second when she reached the familiar step where she had shared her meal the night before. The alley was empty now except for the distant sound of traffic echoing between the brick walls. Lily stood there longer than she intended, half expecting the stranger to appear again from the shadows with his tired coat and thoughtful eyes. But no one came. She shook her head gently and finished her task before returning inside the warm glow of the diner. Across the city at that same moment, Alexander Reed stood at the long conference table inside the headquarters of Reed Global Industries. Around him, several executives discussed numbers displayed on a large screen, while the board of directors listened with serious attention. Words like growth, investment, and expansion filled the room. Yet Alexander heard very little of it. His thoughts kept returning to the quiet alley behind the diner and the young woman who had shared her last meal without hesitation. When the presentation ended, one of the directors asked if he had any comments on the proposal. Alexander folded his hands calmly before speaking in a measured voice. "There is something more important than the numbers on that screen," he said. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward him. "Our company was built on the idea that opportunity should exist for everyone willing to work for it. Yet I wonder how often we forget the people who struggle every day just to stay afloat." Some of the directors exchanged uncertain looks, but Alexander continued speaking with quiet conviction. "Earlier this week I met someone who reminded me what real character looks like. Someone who had almost nothing, yet still chose kindness. That kind of person is exactly who this company should notice." When the meeting ended, Caroline approached him again in the hallway outside the conference room. "Do you want me to locate her?" she asked softly. Alexander paused beside the tall window overlooking the city lights. "Yes," he replied after a moment. "Find the diner on the east side, near the old brick warehouses. Her name is Lily Anderson." Caroline nodded and made a note on her tablet. As she walked away to begin the search, Alexander remained by the window for several seconds, watching the endless movement of headlights below. Somewhere out there, Lily Anderson was finishing another long shift, unaware that the man she had helped in the alley had just set an entire corporate office in motion to find her again. The following morning, the city carried the steady rhythm of another workday, as traffic moved through the wide avenues and office towers filled with the quiet urgency of people chasing deadlines and opportunities. Inside the headquarters of Reed Global Industries, the atmosphere felt sharper than usual. On the 38th floor, Caroline Hayes stepped out of the elevator holding a folder and a tablet, walking quickly toward the private office of Alexander Reed. She had spent the entire early morning gathering information, just as he had requested. When she knocked lightly and entered the office, Alexander was already standing near the window with a cup of black coffee in his hand. The skyline stretched far into the distance behind him, while the rising sun reflected across the glass buildings of the financial district. Caroline placed a folder on his desk. "I located the diner you mentioned," she said calmly. "It sits on the east side of the city, near the old brick warehouses. The business license lists it as Harbor Street Diner, and the staff roster includes a waitress named Lily Anderson." Alexander turned from the window slowly, his expression thoughtful but focused. Caroline continued speaking while opening the folder. "She works 6 days a week, usually the afternoon and evening shift. According to public records, she rents a small room above a convenience store 3 blocks from the diner. No family listed in the city and no previous employment beyond small service jobs." Alexander listened quietly without interrupting. There was nothing remarkable in the information Caroline had gathered. In fact, Lily Anderson appeared to be exactly what she seemed to be the night they met. A young woman working long hours, simply trying to stay afloat in a city that rarely slowed down for anyone. Alexander walked to the desk and looked down at the folder before closing it gently. "Thank you, Caroline. That will be enough for now." Caroline studied him for a moment before asking the question she had been holding since the previous night. "What do you plan to do next?" Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the folded takeout container that still rested beside his documents. For a moment, he simply looked at it, as if remembering the quiet alley behind the diner and the simple kindness that had interrupted his experiment in the city. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. "I'm going to visit the diner again. Caroline raised an eyebrow slightly. As yourself, or as the same stranger she met that night? Alexander allowed a faint smile. As the stranger. At least for now. Meanwhile, across town, Lily Anderson was beginning another long shift at Harbor Street Diner. The morning customers had already come and gone, leaving the counter temporarily quiet, except for the sound of coffee pouring into ceramic mugs. Lily wiped down the last empty booth before tying her apron and checking the order slips near the kitchen window. Megan walked past carrying a tray of pancakes and leaned close enough to whisper, "The lunch crowd will be here soon. I hope you are ready." Lily laughed softly. Ready or not, it always comes. Yet as she moved between tables that day, she could not shake the strange feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. The memory of the man she had shared her meal with continued to linger in her thoughts like a story waiting for its next chapter. Late that afternoon, as the sky outside turned pale gold with the approach of evening, the bell above the diner door rang again. Lily glanced up automatically from behind the counter. For a moment she froze. Standing near the entrance was the same man she had seen in the alley. His coat looked just as worn as before, and his posture carried the same quiet calm. He stepped inside, slowly, as if unsure whether he would be recognized. Lily felt a mixture of surprise and curiosity rise in her chest. She walked toward him with a small, uncertain smile. "I did not expect to see you again," she said gently. The man returned the smile with the same thoughtful expression she remembered. "Neither did I," he replied softly, "but I could not forget the kindness you showed me the other night." Lily gestured toward an empty booth near the window. "Then you should sit down," she said warmly. "Maybe this time I can at least offer you a cup of coffee." And as Alexander Reed slid into the booth across from the young waitress who had unknowingly changed the direction of his thoughts, the quiet meeting that began with a shared meal in an alley was about to move one step closer to revealing a truth that would surprise them both. The quiet booth near the window carried the soft glow of the late afternoon sun as it filtered through the glass and stretched across the polished table. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, cars passing along Harbor Street while distant horns echoed between tall buildings. Inside the diner, however, time seemed as slow as Lily Anderson set a ceramic mug of fresh coffee in front of the man who had returned from the alley. She slid into the seat across from him for just a moment before the next wave of customers arrived. "I never even asked your name the other night," she said with a friendly curiosity. The man wrapped his hands around the warm mug before answering. "My name is Alex," he said calmly. Lily nodded once. "Alex, that sounds better than calling you stranger." He smiled quietly at that and took a slow sip of coffee. The warmth seemed to settle into him, as if the simple drink carried more comfort than the polished offices he had left behind earlier that day. For several minutes, they spoke casually while the low hum of conversation continued throughout the diner. Lily told him how busy the place became during the evening hours and how most of the regular customers had been coming there for years. Alex listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking small questions about her work or the neighborhood. Yet even as he listened, his eyes moved across the room with the calm awareness of someone used to observing every detail around him. Finally, Lily leaned back slightly and folded her arms with a playful expression. "You do not seem like someone who usually spends time behind diners and dumpsters." Alex let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Life can take people to unexpected places," he replied. Lily studied his face for a moment, as if deciding whether to press the question further. Something about him still felt different from the other men who passed through the diner each day. There was a steadiness in the way he spoke and the way he carried himself that did not quite match the worn coat he wore. Before she could ask another question, the front door of the diner opened again, and Megan hurried over with a tray of drinks. "Lily, I need help at table 3, she whispered quickly. Lily nodded and stood from the booth. "Do not go anywhere," she said to Alex with a small smile. "I will be right back." Alex watched her move quickly between tables, greeting customers and delivering plates with the same quiet kindness she had shown him the night before. The scene felt strangely grounding compared to the endless meetings and negotiations that usually filled his schedule. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply sit there and observe the life unfolding inside the diner. A father laughed with his adult daughter over a shared slice of pie, while two construction workers argued playfully about the outcome of a baseball game playing on the small television above the counter. The simple moments felt genuine in a way the polished boardrooms of Reed Global rarely did. When Lily returned a few minutes later, she slid back into the booth with a tired breath. "Sorry about that," she said. "Dinner rush never waits for good conversation." Alex shook his head. "I do not mind. In fact, it is nice to sit somewhere that feels real." Lily tilted her head slightly at that answer. "Most people in this city are trying to get somewhere better than a diner booth," she said. Alex looked down at the coffee in his hands before speaking again. "Sometimes the places people overlook are the ones that remind you what actually matters." Lily was about to respond when the front door opened once more and two men in dark suits stepped inside. They paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room until their eyes landed on Alex, sitting at the booth. The taller of the two approached slowly with a controlled urgency in his posture. Lily noticed the sudden tension in Alex's shoulders before the man spoke. "Mr. Reed, we have been looking everywhere for you." The words seemed to freeze the air around the booth. Lily blinked in confusion as the name echoed in her mind. "Mr. Reed," the man continued, speaking respectfully but firmly. "The board meeting begins in less than an hour, and the directors are waiting for you at headquarters." Lily slowly turned back toward Alex, her expression shifting from curiosity to stunned disbelief. Alex remained seated for a moment longer before giving a quiet sigh. He looked up at Lily with an expression that carried both honesty and apology. "I suppose I should explain something," he said gently, because the truth was about to change the way Lily Anderson saw the quiet stranger who had shared her meal in the alley. The words from the man in the suit seemed to echo through the quiet diner, as if the entire room had suddenly leaned closer to listen. Lily Anderson remained standing beside the booth, her hands still resting on the edge of the table, while her mind tried to make sense of what she had just heard. "Mr. Reed." The name repeated inside her thoughts like a puzzle piece that did not yet fit. She looked from the man in the suit back to Alex, the stranger who had shared coffee with her only moments earlier. For the first time, she noticed how the two men behind him stood with careful respect, the kind of posture usually reserved for someone important. Alex let out a slow breath and stood from the booth. The worn coat he wore still made him look like the same quiet man from the alley. Yet the calm authority in the room had shifted in a way Lily could not ignore. "I should not have let it happen like this," he said gently while turning back toward her. Lily crossed her arms slowly, still trying to process the moment. "Mr. Reed," she repeated softly. "Is that your name or something else entirely?" Alex hesitated only a second before answering honestly. "My full name is Alexander Reed." Lily felt her stomach tighten with sudden realization, even before the rest of his words came. "I am the founder and owner of Reed Global Industries." For a brief moment, the world around the booth seemed to fall silent. The hum of the diner faded into the background while Lily searched his face for some sign that he might be joking. But the two men waiting near the door remained still and serious, and the quiet confidence in Alex's voice carried no hint of humor. Reed Global Industries was not just another company in the city. It was one of the largest corporations in the country, a name she had seen printed on delivery trucks, construction projects, and advertisements across entire city blocks. Lily slowly lowered herself into the booth again, as if her legs had suddenly forgotten how to stand. "You're telling me that the man I shared half of my dinner with behind a dumpster is the same man who runs that company?" Alexander nodded once. "Yes." Lily let out a short breath that turned into a soft laugh of disbelief. For a moment, she simply looked at the table between them, where the empty coffee mug still rested. Then she shook her head slowly. "You should understand how strange that sounds from where I'm sitting." Alexander gave a small apologetic smile. "I imagine it does." The two men in suits remained near the entrance, clearly waiting but careful not to interrupt further. Lily leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering with curiosity that now mixed with confusion. "Why were you there in the first place? Why would someone who owns an entire corporation be sitting in an alley asking strangers for food?" Alexander rested his hands on the table and answered with complete honesty. "Because I wanted to understand the world outside my office. For several weeks, I have been walking the city without anyone recognizing me. I wanted to see how people actually live without the influence of my name or my money. Lily listened quietly while the explanation settled in her mind. So you were pretending to be someone else. Not pretending, Alexander said calmly. Just observing. And then you happened to walk out of the diner with your dinner. Lily stared at him for another long moment before speaking again. And I suppose you think that moment told you something important? Alexander nodded slowly. It did, because you were the only person who treated me like a human being instead of a problem to ignore. Lily felt her cheeks warm slightly at the unexpected sincerity in his voice. She looked down at the table and then back up again. We are not exactly easy to ignore now. Alexander glanced briefly toward the two men waiting near the door and then back to her. I should go with them before the board meeting begins, he admitted. But there is something I would like to ask you first. Lily raised an eyebrow cautiously. After the shift ends tonight, would you be willing to continue this conversation somewhere quieter? Because the truth about Alexander Reed had just been revealed, and the next step in their unexpected connection was only beginning to unfold. For several seconds, Lily Anderson simply stared at Alexander Reed, while the quiet noise of the diner slowly returned around them. Plates clattered in the kitchen window, and the bell above the door rang as another customer stepped inside. Yet the small booth near the window felt strangely separated from the rest of the room. Lily leaned back against the seat and folded her arms again, studying the man who only hours earlier she had believed to be a tired stranger from the alley. So let me understand this correctly, she said slowly. You're the man who owns Reed Global Industries, and somehow you decided to spend your time walking around the city like an ordinary person. Alexander nodded calmly. That is correct. Lily shook her head in disbelief, but there was no anger in her expression, only confusion mixed with curiosity. Most people who have that kind of power spend their time in private offices and luxury cars, she said, not sitting behind diners asking strangers for food. Alexander rested his hands on the edge of the table and answered quietly. That is exactly the problem. When people live their entire lives surrounded by wealth and distance, they forget what the world actually feels like. Lily looked at him carefully, noticing again the calm honesty in his voice. Before she could respond, the manager called her name from the counter, asking for help with a new order. Lily glanced toward the kitchen and then back at Alexander. I need to finish my shift, she said. Alexander gave a small, understanding nod. Of course. I will not interrupt your work any longer. Lily stood up from the booth, but paused for a moment before leaving. You asked if we could talk later, she said cautiously. Alexander nodded once. When your shift ends, I would like to continue this conversation somewhere quieter. Lily hesitated only briefly before answering. I finish at 9 tonight. Alexander reached into his pocket and placed a small card on the table. It carried only his name and a simple phone number written beneath it. If you decide you would like to meet again, he said gently, call this number when you are finished. Lily looked down at the card and then back at him. I suppose tonight has already become strange enough that one more surprise will not hurt. Alexander allowed a faint smile before stepping away from the booth and walking toward the entrance where the two suited men were waiting. As he left the diner, the bell above the door rang once more and the cool evening air followed him out into the street. For a long moment, Lily remained standing beside the booth, holding the card in her hand. Megan walked past carrying a tray and noticed her expression. Everything all right? She asked. Lily blinked and quickly slipped the card into her apron pocket. Yes, she answered quietly. Just a long day. Yet as the evening hours passed and the diner filled with customers, Lily could not stop thinking about the conversation she had just had. The stranger from the alley was not simply a traveler or a man in trouble. He was one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. The idea still felt impossible to accept. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander Reed returned to the towering headquarters of Reed Global Industries, where the lights of the conference floor were already glowing against the darkening sky. Inside the boardroom, several directors were discussing upcoming expansion plans while financial projections appeared on a large screen. When Alexander entered the room, the conversation stopped immediately. One of the directors cleared his throat and spoke first. We were beginning to wonder if something important had delayed you. Alexander took his seat at the head of the long table with calm confidence. "Something important did delay me," he replied. "Because earlier today, I was reminded that the strength of any company is not measured only by profit or expansion. It is measured by the character of the people who keep working even when life gives them very little." Several of the directors exchanged puzzled glances, but Alexander did not explain further. His thoughts were already drifting back toward the small diner on Harbor Street where a young waitress named Lily Anderson was finishing her shift and deciding whether she would call the number he had left behind. The diner finally began to quiet as the evening moved closer to night, and the last few customers finished their meals under the warm yellow lights above the tables. Outside Harbor Street, the traffic had slowed to a steady trickle of passing cars and distant buses. Lily Anderson wiped down the final booth and carried a stack of plates toward the kitchen window while the cook turned off the grill behind the counter. The long shift had left her shoulders aching and her feet sore, yet her thoughts remained far from the usual tired relief that came at the end of the day. Instead, her mind kept returning to the small card resting in the pocket of her apron. Megan stepped beside her while tying her jacket. "You look like someone who has been thinking all night," she said with a curious smile. Lily hesitated before answering. "Have you ever met someone and then realized they were completely different from what you first believed?" Megan laughed softly. "That happens every day in this city." "Why do you ask?" Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out the card Alexander had left on the table earlier that evening. Megan leaned closer to read the name printed across it. "Alexander Reed." Her eyes widened slightly. "Wait, the Alexander Reed. The man who runs Reed Global Industries." Lily nodded slowly. "That is what he says." Megan looked from the card back to Lily with clear disbelief. "And he was sitting here in this diner drinking coffee with you." Lily folded the card in her hand again. "Not just drinking coffee. Yesterday, I shared half of my dinner with him in the alley because I thought he was just another stranger who had not eaten all day." Megan stared for a moment before shaking her head with amazement. "That might be the strangest story I have heard in years." Lily gave a small, uncertain laugh, but the confusion in her eyes remained. "He asked me to call him after my shift so we could talk more." Megan crossed her arms thoughtfully. "And are you going to call?" Lily looked toward the front window where the city lights flickered across the glass. "I do not know yet," she admitted quietly. "Part of me still feels like the whole thing cannot possibly be real." Megan placed a hand on her shoulder before heading toward the door. "If a man like that leaves his number and asks to see you again, I would at least hear what he has to say." Lily watched her friend leave and then slowly untied her apron. The diner lights dimmed one by one as the manager locked the front door and began counting the register behind the counter. Lily stepped outside into the cool night air with the card still in her hand. Harbor Street was nearly empty now except for a few parked cars and the distant glow of traffic lights down the block. She stood there for a long moment staring at the number written beneath Alexander Reed's name. Across the city at the same moment, Alexander sat alone in his private office high above the skyline. The board meeting had ended hours earlier, but the lights in his office remained on while the rest of the building slowly grew quiet. Caroline Hayes knocked lightly before stepping inside with a folder of reports. "The directors approved the expansion plan," she said calmly. "Construction will begin next month." Alexander nodded, but his attention drifted toward the phone resting on his desk. Caroline followed his gaze and allowed a knowing smile. "You're waiting to see if she calls." Alexander did not deny it. "Some meetings have a way of changing your perspective more than others," he replied. Caroline set the folder down and turned toward the door. "For what it is worth," she said before leaving, "the people who act with kindness when no one is watching are usually worth knowing." When the office door closed again, Alexander remained seated in the quiet room, watching the city lights below. Minutes passed slowly. Then at last the phone on his desk began to ring. He reached forward and answered calmly. "Hello." On the other end of the line, Lily Anderson stood beneath the dim streetlight outside Harbor Street Diner, holding the phone carefully against her ear. "Hi," she said softly. "This is Lily. I think we still have a conversation to finish." The quiet street outside Harbor Street Diner carried the soft echo of distant traffic as Lily Anderson held her phone close to her ear beneath the dim streetlight. Her heart beat a little faster than usual, not from fear, but from the strange feeling that something in her life had just begun to shift in a way she could not fully predict. On the other end of the call, Alexander Reed leaned back in the chair behind his desk high above the city while the lights from the skyline reflected softly across the wide glass windows of his office. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander answered with calm warmth in his voice. "I'm glad you called, Lily." Lily gave a small, nervous laugh that carried through the phone line. "I almost did not." Alexander waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts. "I kept telling myself that a man who runs one of the largest companies in the country probably has better things to do than talk with a waitress who shared a cheap dinner with him in an alley." Alexander shook his head, even though she could not see the gesture. "That dinner was not cheap to me," he replied quietly. "It was one of the most honest moments I have had in a long time." Lily looked down the empty street where the yellow light stretched across the pavement. "So what happens now?" she asked. Alexander considered the question before answering. "Now we finish the conversation we started." Lily hesitated again before speaking. "All right, but I think it should happen somewhere that is not a diner booth or a dark alley." Alexander allowed a small smile. "I agree. If you're comfortable with it, I can have a car pick you up and bring you here so we can talk in person." Lily immediately shook her head, even though he could not see her reaction. "No," she said quickly. "That might be a little too much for the first real conversation." Alexander respected the hesitation in her voice. "Then perhaps we meet somewhere in the middle. There is a quiet restaurant near the river not far from Harbor Street. Nothing extravagant, just a place where we can talk without interruptions." Lily thought about the idea while watching the faint reflection of the streetlight on the window of the closed diner. After a moment, she nodded, even though he still could not see her. "All right," she said. "I suppose one unusual evening deserves another." Alexander glanced at the clock on the wall of his office. "Give me 30 minutes to leave the building and meet you there." Lily slipped the phone back into her jacket pocket once the call ended and began walking slowly down Harbor Street toward the river. The night air felt cool and fresh compared to the warm kitchen she had just left behind. Across the city, Alexander gathered the few papers on his desk and turned off the lights in his office before stepping into the quiet hallway outside. Caroline Hayes was still working at her desk when he passed by. "Late evening meeting?" she asked with a knowing smile. Alexander paused only briefly. "Something like that," he replied before heading toward the elevator. Less than 30 minutes later, Lily arrived at the small restaurant overlooking the river, where soft lights reflected across the dark water beyond the windows. She stood near the entrance for a moment, wondering if she had made a mistake stepping into a world that felt so far from her own. Then the door opened behind her, and Alexander Reed walked inside, wearing the same calm expression she remembered from the alley. For a moment, neither of them spoke, as the quiet reality of their second meeting settled between them. Finally, Lily gave a small smile. "I have to admit something," she said. Alexander waited patiently. Lily took a slow breath before continuing. "Yesterday, I thought I was helping a hungry stranger. Tonight, I am having dinner with one of the most powerful business leaders in the country." Alexander met her eyes with the same quiet sincerity he had shown from the beginning. "And I am still the same man who appreciated half of a simple meal more than anything else that night." Because the truth was that the distance between their two worlds had not disappeared, yet something much stronger than status had already begun to connect them. The quiet restaurant beside the river carried a calm atmosphere that felt far removed from the noise of Harbor Street. Soft music played somewhere in the background, while the reflection of city lights shimmered across the dark water outside the wide windows. Lily Anderson sat across from Alexander Reed at a small table near the glass, still adjusting to the strange reality that the man in front of her had once appeared as a tired stranger in an alley only to reveal himself as one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. A server placed 2 simple plates of food on the table before leaving them alone again. For a moment, Lily simply watched the river outside, while the events of the past 2 days continued to rearrange themselves inside her thoughts. Finally, she looked back toward Alexander. "I keep trying to understand something," she said slowly. When you first sat down in that alley, you did not tell me who you were. You did not even hint at it. Alexander rested his hands calmly on the table before answering. That was the point of the entire experiment. Lily tilted her head slightly. Experiment. Alexander nodded. For several weeks, I have been moving through the city without anyone recognizing me. I wanted to see how people treated someone who had nothing to offer them. No title, no influence, no noviat. Lily studied him carefully. And what did you learn? Alexander looked toward the window where the river moved slowly through the night. I learned that most people are too busy surviving their own problems to notice someone else who is struggling. But I also learned that kindness still exists in places where no one expects it. He looked back toward her with quiet sincerity. That kindness came from you. Lily felt her cheeks warm slightly and looked down at her plate. I did not do anything special, she said softly. I just shared a meal. Alexander shook his head gently. You shared your last meal with someone you believed had nothing. That decision told me more about your character than any background report ever could. Lily laughed quietly at that. Background report. I suppose that means your assistant already knows everything about me. Alexander gave an honest answer. She gathered basic information after I asked her to find the diner again. Nothing beyond what any public record would show. Lily leaned back slightly in her chair. So now that you have found me again, what exactly do you want? Alexander took a moment before replying. I want to offer you an opportunity. Lily raised an eyebrow with curiosity. Opportunity. Alexander nodded. Reed Global Industries operates several community development programs across the city. Programs that help small businesses grow and help people find stable work. I believe someone with your perspective could bring something valuable to those programs. Lily blinked in surprise. You're offering me a job. Alexander nodded again. Not because you helped me, but because the way you think about people is exactly the kind of perspective many organizations lose as they grow larger. Lily looked down at the table while the idea slowly settled in her mind. Her life had always been measured by long shifts and small paychecks. The possibility of stepping into a completely different world felt almost impossible to imagine. I did not know anything about running programs or working in large companies, she admitted honestly. Alexander smiled with calm confidence. Skills can be learned. Character cannot. That is why I am asking you to consider it. Lily looked up again and met his eyes across the table. For the first time since the strange journey began, she felt the distance between their two worlds begin to narrow. Not because of money or power, but because the man who owned an entire corporation still remembered the simple moment when a tired waitress chose to treat a stranger with kindness. And as the river continued moving quietly beyond the windows, Lily Anderson realized that the small decision she made in an alley had opened a door to a future she had never imagined. The quiet restaurant by the river had grown calmer as the evening moved deeper into the night, leaving only a few tables occupied beneath the warm lights that reflected softly across the glass windows. Outside, the water moved slowly through the city, while distant traffic hummed far beyond the riverbank. Lily Anderson remained seated across from Alexander Reed, her hands resting lightly on the table while the weight of his offer continued to settle in her mind. The idea still felt unreal. Only 2 nights earlier, she had been sitting behind a diner, sharing half of a simple meal with a man she believed had nowhere else to go. Now that same man was offering her a chance to step into a world she had never imagined for herself. Lily finally let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly in her chair. I have to admit something, she said thoughtfully. My entire life has been built around getting through the next shift or paying the next bill. The idea of helping run programs for a company the size of yours feels a little overwhelming. Alexander listened carefully without interrupting. The calm patience in his expression had remained the same since the moment they first spoke in the alley. That feeling is understandable, he replied gently. Most opportunities look overwhelming when you first encounter them. Lily gave a small smile. That is an elegant way of saying you think I will learn quickly. Alexander returned the smile. I believe people grow when they are given a chance to do something meaningful. And what you did that night showed me that you already understand something many executives forget. Lily raised an eyebrow. Which is, Alexander leaned slightly forward and answered without hesitation. That people are not numbers. They are stories. Each person you pass on the street carries a life you cannot see. Lily lowered her eyes for a moment as she remembered the quiet alley and the tired man who had asked to sit beside her. I never thought that moment would matter to anyone else, she said quietly. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully placed something on the table between them. Lily looked down and immediately recognized the object. It was the folded takeout container from a meal they had shared. The cardboard edges were still slightly bent from being carried in his pocket. You kept it, she said softly. Alexander nodded once. That small meal reminded me of something important. Lily studied the container for a long moment before speaking again. If I say yes to your offer, what exactly would happen next? Alexander answered calmly. You would start by meeting the team that manages our community development projects. They work directly with local businesses and neighborhoods that need support. You would learn how the programs operate and eventually help shape how we reach more people who are struggling to find stable opportunities. Lily listened carefully as he explained. The work sounded very different from the long hours she spent carrying plates between tables. Yet the purpose behind it felt surprisingly familiar. Helping people who were trying to build a better life was something she already understood from watching the customers who came through the diner every day. She looked back at Alexander and spoke slowly. I never expected a simple act of kindness to lead to something like this. Alexander gave a thoughtful nod. Most meaningful things in life begin with moments that seem small at the time. Lily allowed herself a quiet laugh. That may be the most unusual job interview story anyone has ever had. Alexander smiled warmly. Perhaps, but I believe the result will be worth it. Lily looked once more at the folded container on the table and then back toward the man who had carried it with him as a reminder of the moment that had connected their two very different lives. Finally, she nodded with quiet determination. All right, she said. I will try. Alexander extended his hand across the table and she shook it firmly. In that simple gesture, the path that began with a shared meal in a dark alley continued forward toward a future neither of them had expected when they first met. Several months passed after the night Lily Anderson accepted the opportunity that Alexander Reed had offered beside the quiet river restaurant. The change in her life did not happen overnight, but little by little the world that once felt far away slowly became part of her everyday routine. Instead of tying an apron behind the counter of Harbor Street Diner, Lily now walked through the bright lobby of Reed Global Industries, each morning carrying a notebook filled with ideas for the community programs she had begun helping to organize. The first weeks were not easy. The corporate offices felt enormous compared to the small diner where she had once spent most of her time, and many employees looked at her with quiet curiosity when they learned how she had first met the founder of the company. Yet Lily quickly proved that Alexander had been right about her character. She listened carefully to the people who worked in the neighborhoods their programs supported. She spoke with small business owners who struggled to keep their doors open. She visited community centers where families were trying to build better futures for their children. Instead of seeing statistics and reports, Lily saw the same human stories she had always noticed while working long hours at the diner. Within a few months, the team managing the development programs began to rely on her insight. The projects expanded into new neighborhoods, and several small businesses received the support they needed to stay open and grow. One afternoon, Lily stood beside Alexander inside a newly renovated community center that Reed Global had helped fund. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows while a group of local shop owners gathered nearby to discuss plans for improving the surrounding streets. Alexander watched quietly as Lily spoke with them, explaining new training programs and small business loans that could help them stabilize their work. After the meeting ended, the two of them stepped outside onto the sidewalk where the warm afternoon breeze moved gently through the trees. Alexander looked at her with quiet satisfaction. You have accomplished more in a few months than some teams manage in years, he said. Lily laughed softly. I only asked people what they needed and listened to the answers. Alexander nodded. That is exactly why the programs are working. Lily glanced toward the busy street where people moved between stores and restaurants that had recently reopened. Sometimes I still think about the night we met behind the diner, she admitted. It feels strange that something so small could lead to all of this. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the same folded takeout container he had carried since that evening. He had placed it inside a clear protective frame, so the cardboard remained safe and unbroken. Lily smiled when she saw it. You still carry that with you. Alexander looked down at the simple container with thoughtful respect. It reminds me that the strongest decisions often begin with the smallest actions. He paused before looking back toward her. That night you shared your last meal with someone you believed was a stranger. But the truth is that moment changed the direction of both our lives. Lily felt a quiet warmth in her chest as she looked at the framed container and then back at the man standing beside her. The city continued moving around them with the same busy energy it had always carried, yet the connection between them had grown stronger through the work they had begun together. Alexander spoke once more with calm sincerity. Kindness has a way of creating opportunities that no business plan could ever predict. Lily nodded with a peaceful smile. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is the decision to share a simple meal. As the sun slowly lowered over the city skyline, the small act of generosity that began in a dark alley had grown into a future built on compassion, purpose, and the quiet understanding that genuine kindness always finds its way back.